Please welcome Kevin, Ray, Jennifer, and Mike. Well, thank you. Going to have a brief conversation, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you all for such powerful and important dialogues about this issue. One of the things that we know from studying history is that things have not always been this way. So let's go back. When did Native Americans start to be viewed as mascots? I know many of you touched on it in your presentations, but there's a point where this becomes acceptable within this country. When is that and why?
I guess as the historian, I get to go first. So in the 19-teens, there's sort of a trend where universities, colleges, sports teams begin taking on names, right? So Indians, warriors, whatever. Those things don't really get tied, though, to what we consider mascotry, which is a physical body performing, dancing, music, all of those things, until the late 20s and early 30s. What's kind of interesting is when you look sort of across the nation, there's sort of this groundswell that starts in 1926 that really by the early 1950s, it just proliferates everywhere. But a lot of what we know is that when those images are getting created in the late 20s and early 30s and 40s and 50s, they're doing it to basically create fans, to bring students to games, to get donors, but they're drawing on a lot older imagery. And I think that's the thing that's so amazing to me historically is you can literally take, one of these Indian hen images we use as mascots, and you can find newspaper advertisements from the early 1800s where they're using those symbols as advertisements for the bounties that the federal government put on Indian peoples. So I don't know if you guys know this, the federal government had a program where they offered rewards for scalps for men, women, and children, and it was a sort of gradated reward. And those Indian head symbols were a sign that you could turn in your scalp here and be paid. And so I think there's something to that, right, of understanding the length of those symbols as sort of continual throughout the process.
We just opened an exhibition at the NMAI called Americans, and we sort of traced what you're talking about, when did Indians become the symbol? And we connected actually to the Battle of Little Bighorn and say that it was, it's a very interesting response to this massive defeat of American arms. But it was almost as though they said, whoa, those guys must be really brave and strong and cool, right? And so after the Indians were safely confined to reservations, they sort of adopted American Indians as the national mascot, and the popularity of the Wild West shows is the reason that every Indian looks like a Plains Indian in this imagery, even though there were precious few Plains Indians in fact.
I also wanted to say that when, at the time, and you'll check me on this, at the time a lot of these names came up, I want to say there were only 200,000 Native Americans alive, and the last armed conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. government was 1890 at the Wounded Knee Massacre, and so you have less than 200,000 people, and some of which probably saw this as, well, at least they're remembering us somehow. But I'm sure a good majority were like, wait, but what are they in society? Now, God bless the race of Native peoples. There are now 5 million or more. But we also, the U.S. government, my race, almost wiped them off the face of the earth. And so I look at it back then and I go, could you have polled any of those 200,000? Would they have been okay with this?
But also it's that after 1890, Indians became quite invisible in American culture. And so Americans had already decided that they kind of liked Indians, even though they were a little scary. They kind of liked Indians, and so they had to make up some imaginary Indians to be friends with, because the real ones, had problems and were poor and had needs and made demands and all those things, which are very inconvenient.
I think to some extent Hollywood had something to do with the way America looked at Indian people. There were warriors, they were fighting, they were in battles. And it's sort of curious that in this conflict that occurred with American Indians and this government, they nonetheless respected the Indian enough to think that, well, let's adopt that imagery, the iconography, and we respect it, which is sort of how some people do take it, Mike, that at least we're remembered or we're being dealt with in a way that's not negative attention. A lot of Indian people in the country today, and I see, they're trying to use a poll to justify this immoral use of a racial epithet. But a lot of Indian people don't want attention. The attention they've gotten historically has been very negative. The government has imposed things. There was an era called termination where they tried to terminate Indian people. Part of that was all to justify acquiring millions of acres of native land. And so Hollywood, I think, had something to do with people being introduced to the idea of the native as a noble warrior. And that doesn't always happen in conflict. Often you denigrate your opposition or your adversary, whether it's, you don't see a lot of that happening. So some native people are trying to grasp what little they can out of it by saying, well, it's some kind of form of respect.
Ray, in your comments, you talked about the idea that the NFL and some of these other entities see these names as their property. Mike, in your comments, you talked about respect and honor and heritage, which was sort of interesting, because in some ways those comments led me to think about Thanksgiving and the story that we celebrate with Thanksgiving, which is about this idea that Native people had to be sacrificed in order for progress to happen. And so at the heart of a lot of what's being remembered is not a celebration of Native Americans, but a celebration of white supremacy.
And the irony is that white people would have died had natives not been here. I mean, that is the historical irony. When we think about Thanksgiving, the story is, that there was this peaceful dinner and they all sat down and everything got along. And what it actually really hides is the fact that white people needed native knowledge about the land, about hunting, farming, fishing, water, all of those things. And I think, this goes back to, I think, many of our remarks about the effect of these things on children. When you tell children, there's this peaceful handshake moment, it sort of hides the very complex ways in which Native peoples are the reason why America is here today. And I think that's troubling to me as a sort of scholar thinking about these issues.
Well, I'm not. I know the history that I've taught, but when you think about sort of the way the mindset was of the people who first came here, I mean, they were escaping a climate of intolerance, religious intolerance. The king owned everything. You didn't own your own land. The king owned all the land, and the church was above the king. And so when men came here and they looked around, they had to justify the way that they took the land, because in their own mindset. And so it goes back to their religious beliefs and why it justified them acquiring the land and actually even killing people, because they interpreted the Indian as not part of their God belief system. And so, because it's an amazing, but their mentality when they came here, they came across the ocean, they're starving, they're trying to create something, and they couldn't help themselves. They started to replicate what they came from, where they had dominion, where they took over, when they killed people who they're opposing to. Now, there were great Indian governments and civilizations here, whether people realize that. The Constitution of the United States was modeled after the Constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy, of which we're a member. I'm Oneida Indian. So there was these governments, and the way they existed, an oligarchy within an oligarchy, was the same model, but they didn't see that model. They came from a place where it was conquest, and it was kill or be killed, and it wasn't about making relationships or establishing respectful relationships. But with the native people, that's how they lived, and that's how they treated them. They were generous. They showed them. They helped them. They helped them survive, unfortunately. mascots.
I mean, the tone deafness over time, Damion, is just, it's beyond sad. Like, the team has a Twitter account in which every year they tweet out, Happy Thanksgiving. They have no idea what, and they get skewered, of course, in their mentions after that. But it's unbelievable that they think that this is something that can just go by them, and that you don't think about how many. I'm just curious, how many people here like dressed up as an Indian for Halloween when they were a kid, or was played one in a Thanksgiving play? I mean, I'm guilty as charged. My aunt made the best buckskin outfit you ever saw in your life. Like to this day, I thought it was my coolest costume, and it wasn't until I got older I go, that was kind of messed up. What's even worse, they still sell this stuff in these costume stores.
Or that you still dress up in it?
What other race of people can you buy their costume in the costume store? It's not like, I mean, a rapper is a profession. It's still a little offensive, but it's a profession. A cowboy is a profession. Pocahontas is a person. It's unbelievable.
Jennifer, in your comments, you talked about the financial implications of these mascots and the concern about generating income. There have been a number of studies which seem to suggest that a number of the schools that have gotten rid of these mascots have not suffered financially and have not sort of lost the support of their alumni, these two great fears that we often hear. Why do you think, in the face of that evidence, we still see this persistent holding on to these mascots by a few colleges, universities, and other teams?
So I think there's a two-part answer to that. So Miami University, for example, in 1997 did away with its R-word mascot, and there was a lot of concern about we're going to lose revenue, we're going to lose donors. And in fact, they, in coincidence, went to the Sweet 16 that year, but they also ended up selling massive amounts of apparel the following year because everybody wanted the new stuff, right? What's interesting, though, about this is one of the things that's sort of hidden in a lot of these conversations and that unfortunately journalists don't cover very often is that these universities are not giving up their trademark right or licensing rights to these images. And in fact, there's the National Collegiate Apparel Company, which is headquartered, I think it's in North Carolina or South Carolina, continues to license what's called throwback merchandise, where they still use these images and you can still buy it. So the University of Illinois, who did away with their mascot 10 years ago now, continues to license and sell that image and protect that trademark. And in fact, the university is currently fighting a war with its own student body because the students like to use the Indian images for things like Green Beer Day and social clubs and things like that. And the university aggressively cracks down on that when people notice. They let it go the rest of the time. If the newspapers and the public are not paying attention, they've got no problem. But as soon as the first article gets written saying this is a problem, then all of a sudden there's some cease and desist letters. I think when we think about the financial implications, though, when we think about this, we have this romantic notion, right, that sport is a national pastime, that it's something fun, it's enjoyable. Sport is big business. And universities, colleges, even high schools make lots of money selling things. And I think when we think about, the argument of people are going to walk away with their money, well, they may walk away with their money, but somebody else probably isn't donating because of it. I mean, I know I don't donate to my alma mater because they have one of these mascots. I put my money into NMAI and to other things that, matter to me. So, the money matters. Where you put your money is about your own ethics. And the fact that universities that say they're about educating people to break down stereotypes about race and racism and gender and sexuality and all of these things continue to make money off of it says a lot about where we are as a nation.
And they have to keep using that merchandise to protect their trademark, just in case somebody else grabs it and does something with it. But it's sort of interesting. Football is a real fundraiser for schools to have a football team that's successful. Actually, Carlisle, which was a college or school for, my grandmother went to Carlisle, and Jim Thorpe, and they created Pop Warner at the time wanted to raise money for the school, and one way he thought he could get attention was creating a football team, which is what he did, and they did get that kind of attention. Jim Thorpe actually was, being a Native American, was the first president of the NFL.
Did your grandma know Jim Thorpe?
No, I asked her about that. She said he left just before she got there. Yeah. I was hoping they dated or something.
Kevin, in the film that you showed, one of the lines that really stood out to me was one of the women featured said, "These images don't allow for a modern dialogue about Native Americans." And on the panelists, you've talked about these images coming from the early 19th century. I wonder if you could talk more about that and what's obscured at the contemporary moment by the continued use of these images.
Indians are weirdly and very deliberately nailed to the past by others. We're not allowed to be contemporary. We're not allowed to be doctors, lawyers. We're not allowed to be university professors, engineers, architects. If we do any of those things, then it's thought, well, that you're not a real Indian anymore. And that's really been true since the closing of the Plains Wars. I saw somebody writing an essay about one of our exhibitions, said it's almost as though they took a snapshot at that moment in time, and Indians are not allowed to deviate from that appearance, that image, and that way of life, and still be considered Indian. So that's really what we're talking about when we say that. And by the way, what that also means is that real issues, real challenges, real problems that are facing Native American communities can't have attention because they're contemporary and it's not about, I lost my horse or I got injured in the attack on the fort. Indians are allowed to have those problems. We can't have real problems like a lack of clean water, a lack of adequate health care, or suicide epidemics.
We have time for questions from the audience. I see someone in the back.
Good morning and thank you. Kevin, I was struck by your comment, the Confederates won the peace. How do you relate that to Make America Great Again and the attack on the players who were protesting during the football games?
Yeah, first of all, credit where it's due. That was Lonnie Bunch that said that they won the peace.
I'm sorry.
But I'm happy to be mistaken for Lonnie anytime. And they're all related, of course, right? And so, a president who stands a couple of Navajo code talkers in front of a portrait of Andrew Jackson, someone who would criticize and mischaracterize the protests of the African American athletes and others in the National Football League, and sort of try to turn the public on them by saying they're attacking the flag, they're attacking the national anthem, when we all know that's not what the protest was about, and that they had no desire to attack the flag. Those things are all related, and there is a clientele, if you will. There is a lot of people out there who want to hear that. That is what they believe. That is their preferred version. And it all arises from a failure of everyone not to understand the whole of our history, the complexity of it, how we've been interacting, all these different kinds of people, for literally centuries. And trying to instead adhere to a sanitized version of history, where Robert E. Lee is a great hero and not a traitor. You know why? Because it gets really uncomfortable if we start thinking about Robert E. Lee as a traitor. It gets really uncomfortable. We're not the best country ever if we focus too much on nasty business like the dispossession of Indians and the enslavement of Africans and African Americans. So it hurts our little American heads to have to grapple with this history, and it really shouldn't, because every country has histories like this.
Thank you.
So that's what it's about.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Tyrone Nero, and I guess I thank you for your presentation, but my question comes from a different perspective. So as an African American, born and raised in Mount Vernon, New York, I was a military man. I went up to Alaska and I worked at Fairbanks Native Association for about 2 years. So I looked at the integration of the natives in the community that had to come to Fairbanks because of their addiction. And I looked at the correlation of what would happen in Harlem, Compton, St. Louis, and I said, well, these are the same things. But there's this Alaska dividend that was different. Like if you're a citizen, you get $2,000, but if you're a Native American, you get like $10,000 a year. And I was like, well, on the integration purpose, the timeline, I see that Native Americans were here before Christopher Columbus, but there were also blacks. So like when we follow up in our communication of the timeline, where are we at as far as helping that relationship to identify the blacks that were cohabitating with the Native Americans?
So, I mean, I think one of the things that may help contextualize your issue a little bit is it's not like Native peoples in Alaska just get a check for being there, right?
Well,
Like
they get it for the oil.
But those payments are actually tied to treaties and to contracts and mineral rights that are much older than today's moment, right? And so when we think about those issues, I think the better question for me is sort of not an either-or situation, but what does it look like to begin recognizing Afro-Natives? What does it begin looking like to say, it's in America, we're not either-or in many cases, and in fact, there are so many similarities between the history of African Americans and Natives. There are all kinds of tribes with, complete integration because they were the savior for many people who were fleeing from white oppressors in terms of giving them a space to become part of a community. So I think part of it is that we have historical amnesia about things like money and how we got here. And because of that, people like to write stories as if being Native in Alaska is some sort of gift you're being given. And that's not a gift. That's payment for losing your land or payment for your land being, taken apart by the federal government for mining and mineral and oil rights and other things,
Point, there were blacks that were cohabitating with natives, so they weren't beneficiaries of the same minerals in the land?
1924, the Dawes Act established who was a member of a tribe, and the U.S. government was very concerned with ensuring that the fewest people possible would be listed on the Dawes Act because that set the rates of reimbursement for Native peoples related to the care that government gave. So the government was very good at going through and saying, you look a little too brown. Are you sure you've been here for 3 generations? You look a little too brown. I don't really know, right? And I think that's part of this history is that the government has a long pattern of reducing people who can claim Native ancestry because of creating Native nations as domestic sovereignties.
Can I just say something off the cuff? And I think it's a great question. One of the great things that has happened in the Change the Name movement over the last 5 years, I would say, is there's a real interest in this issue of African Americans. Richard Sherman, the NFL cornerback for the Seattle Seahawks, Champ Bailey, the former cornerback for the Broncos, people like that speaking out against the team's name, former players, but to me it's like Black Lives Matter. Like Black Lives Matter shouldn't be about the black community taking ownership of that. That's a people problem to us. Yes, it specifically affects black people. That's people, we should all be in on that. As I feel the exact same way about this name. Like, until we all take ownership that this is not a Native American issue, but a people issue, a human rights issue, I think we're all in trouble. And so the shared purpose, Eleanor Holmes Norton talks about, the DC Congresswoman talks about it often. Her whole thought is, if you saw the shared experience, especially of people of color in this country, you could not deny this kind of thing. You could not deny Black Lives Matter. It's like if you're only fighting racism in your own community, you're not really fighting racism. You got to be about everybody.
I'd like to follow up on that. I really think the question is, let's not create a myth that just because you're outsiders, that you've suffered, that you have common ground. I really think that one of the great questions in Washington is, Why aren't more African Americans who have embraced this Washington football team, why aren't they really at that fight to really try to champion change? And so I think the challenge here is to both realize where African Americans and Native people come together, but also where they diverge, right? Just because everybody black swears they have Native blood doesn't mean they really do. But also the fact that the military plays a crucial role for the African American community, and part of that role was fighting Native peoples. So I guess what I really want you to talk a little bit more about is this notion of where is there common ground on these issues with race and where is not.
I mean, so in my mind, I think a lot of the common ground is about education in our children. Many of the same stereotypes, even though the words are different, the same sentiments, the same processes that are levied against Native peoples are levied against African and African Americans. There's amazing consistency for me in the things you read that people write and how they talk about Native peoples, how they talk about African Americans. I'm always surprised when I encounter people who say they've never met somebody who's Native and then say, but I have a black friend, right? And I'm sort of looking at them thinking, that tells me you're not paying attention. You're not paying attention to the world around you if you don't see African American communities, if you don't see Native communities. And I think that's the thing that's the commonality is, I think willful ignorance and not seeing those communities and the richness and the power and the culture and all the things that make those communities vibrant. We've done a very good job of educating people not to pay attention to those things in America.
I would say, like, the Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, his great line, you know, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. The apathy is, to me, the scariest thing.
One thing I would add is that it does seem to me African Americans and Native Americans certainly share the phenomenon of an ongoing effort at erasure from history, so that our stories are not being consistently told. Our stories are not even a part of the American story, and yet properly viewed, both are central to the American story. Indeed, you cannot tell the American story without including Natives and African Americans. But to Lonnie's larger point, you know, when African Americans and Native Americans get together, the results are not always happy. We are different peoples. We've clashed, we've oppressed each other, we've done terrible things to each other at different points in history. At this time, though, we have a great many commonalities. Probably the most important is that we both have suffered a history of oppression and face many of the same economic challenges and social challenges that the other faces.
I just wanted to add to African American people in this area, especially having lived here for 14 years, some of the most forgiving people that I've ever seen in my life. And I grew up in Hawaii, where land was taken there too. The fact that people can be fans of this team in many ways, given its history, blows me away. George Preston Marshall, the first owner, was an avowed segregationist. The team, several years ago, the team was going to screen a movie called The Forgotten Four for African-American players who integrated the NFL. And it was going to screen it for its season ticket holders, players, administration. And at the last minute, they pulled out. And the guy from Epix, the movie company, called me up because I think we got a story here. And I go, what's the story? He said, well, they don't want to screen this film. And I go, well, why not? And he goes, because it implicitly shows that George Preston Marshall and George Halas got together at the 1933 ownership meetings of the NFL and led a whole block of owners to make sure that black players would not play in the NFL. And they didn't for 15 years after that. Washington was the last team to integrate. It blows me, it boggles my mind in some ways. Shirley Povich had one of the great lines of all time in his column, the late columnist for the Washington Post. When Jim Brown just ran all over the team in the early 1960s, he said, Jim Brown integrated the end zone in Washington 4 times.
I'm Jim Lowen. Some of you know my work about Confederate monuments, and you may also know that I actually got the OAH, the Organization of American Historians, to take a stand against the Washington R team. And I have a suggestion. A lot of people are opposed, or they say they are opposed, and I think actually many of them are really, to taking away all these monuments. For example, Teddy Roosevelt in front of the American Museum of Natural History, and all those amazing 4 continents, or whatever they were, 4 races in front of your museum in New York. All those monuments and the Confederate monuments that are all over the place, they're against taking them away because this is supposedly erasing our history. It's also supposed to be Taliban-like, and it's against art and all that kind of thing. And so my suggestion is we should take them all and put them in a park, a Nadir of Race Relations park, that talks about this terrible era that, Kevin, you mentioned, 1890 to 1940 or so, during which most of these went up. And I was just thinking, sitting here in the audience, that the space that's not very much used around the National Museum of American History would be a good place for that park. We've got these sculpture parks, all over the place. So I'm wondering what you think about that idea, because that would, you would learn something just looking at it, just going into it, and of course the entire context would be, look what we, and I'm going to say it, look what we white people did between 1890 and 1940. Look at our ideology. Here are material objects that show it.
My response would be, I think we should leave them where they are and say what you just said, and put that on them right in the places they are. So, and in fact, who knows? Maybe some museum there in New York will do exactly that in front of the continents, or in front of the Teddy Roosevelt monument. I think that I don't know, that making a park, it almost that almost feels like we're glorifying it too much. I think I think all the time, frankly, about what to do in front of our museum in New York City, and how to contextualize that, and how to get across to visitors, and those, hundreds of thousands of people cross in front of that every day. How to say to them, stop, look at this, and get what this is about. And so I think, in a way, taking them out of context, taking them out of the places that they are, probably is, to my mind, is probably not the way to do it. But frankly, I don't feel strongly about that.
Okay. We've got time for one quick question and 1 or 2 quick responses.
Hello, my name is Jamie Chaplin. I'm Director of Communications and Development for Howard University Graduate School. I went to a college called Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that background story.
We got a quick question.
Okay, well, long story short, we managed to change the mascot twice. Went from the Bears, then now we're the Crimson Hawks. So my question is, and I'm still hearing from alum that being called Crimson Hawks is still an issue because it's symbolism. So my question is, what type of name changes and visuals do you think are acceptable without continuing racial or cultural offenses?
Well, one way to address that, and we're doing that actually where we are, in a city that's named after us, the city of Oneida, is the institution is speaking to Native people who are in that region and are sensitive, and that makes a lot of sense for them. Florida did that with their team, and if the Florida Seminoles are acceptable, I'm okay.
I just think we need to stop making mascots and logos out of living people. That to me it's basic human decency.
Join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion. Let's start here.
Well, if your imaginations haven't been stimulated and your thought process hasn't been stimulated, then you must have been asleep all morning. We are going to break for lunch now, and we're going to try to get back by 12:55 so that we can stay on schedule, and then hear our keynote speaker, who I promise you is going to be something else. So enjoy your lunch and see you at 12:55.